just a floor nurse restocking 4 bags. That's what Dr. Pierce saw when Katie Rodriguez moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU at 6:02 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, her hands methodical, her breathing controlled, her eyes tracking the inventory with the precision of someone trained to manage logistics under fire. He didn't see the call sign whispered in terror across 3 provinces of Iraq. He didn't see the woman who'd extracted 17 hostages from a compound in Anbar in 2019 without losing a single operative. He didn't see Captain Rodriguez, he saw an inexperienced hire who asked too many questions about billing codes and medication charges, someone who didn't yet understand how Cedar Creek Medical actually functioned. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency as she reached for another box of fur tubing, and the faint scar tissue on her left forearm caught the white glare, a thin line of pale skin running from wrist to elbow, the kind of scar that didn't come from nursing school accidents. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin at her temples. 3 months. She'd been at Cedar Creek for exactly 3 months, and in that time she'd become the nurse who arrived before dawn, who volunteered for the patients no one else wanted, who sat alone in the break room with her lunch untouched while she read the hospital's policy manuals like they were classified intelligence briefs. In her locker in the basement, wrapped in black microfiber cloth, sat a folded American flag. She touched it once each shift before closing the metal door, a ritual as precise as a combat checklist. The hospital smelled like ammonia and hand sanitizer, with an undertone of something metallic that Katie had learned was the scent of old blood that never quite washed away from institutional tile. She'd worked in field hospitals that smelled worse, but Cedar Creek had its own character, a teaching facility in San Antonio that trained residents and saw everything from routine surgeries to trauma codes. The ICU occupied the west wing, 14 beds arranged in a semicircle around the nurses' station, each one visible from the central desk where Dr. Pierce sat at 7:15 a.m., his laptop open, his pen tapping against a clipboard with the rhythm of someone who'd never learned patience. He was 48 years old, with the kind of face that came from generations of private schools and country clubs, a nose that had never been broken, teeth too white to be natural, and eyes that moved across people like a scanner looking for weaknesses. Katie had learned his rhythms in 3 months the way a combat medic learns to read a casualty's vital signs. Dr. Pierce arrived at 7, reviewed charts for 30 minutes, and conducted his initial rounds between 7:30 and 9. He spoke to residents like they were idiots, spoke to attending physicians like they were competitors, and spoke to nurses like they were obstacles in his way. Katie finished restocking the medication cart and rolled it back to the supply station, her movements making no sound on the linoleum floor. Her boots, actual combat boots, broken in over a decade and now resold 4 times, had been replaced by regulation hospital footwear 2 weeks ago after a nursing supervisor gently suggested that more traditional attire would help her blend in. The replacement shoe squeaked on turns. She'd adjusted her gait to minimize the sound, muscle memory from years of precision footwork translating into something that looked like careful hospital professionalism. She was adding notation to the digital inventory system when she noticed the discrepancy, 3 units of 0.5 milligrams epinephrine marked as used yesterday in room 351, but the chart showed the patient had been discharged to home health 3 days prior. She scrolled back. Then further. The medication log showed activity in room 351 that shouldn't have been possible. Katie made a note of the timestamp, 14:32 on March 10th, and pulled up the billing codes for that day. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her breathing remained level. In and through the nose. The way they'd taught her at Fort Benning, the way she'd practiced in Baghdad when IEDs detonated close enough to rattle her teeth. At 7:40 a.m., she approached the nurse's station with her tablet. Dr. Pierce didn't look up from his email. Dr. Pierce, I have a question about the medication log in room 351. The epinephrine usage doesn't align with his laugh cut her off. Not a genuine laugh, but something that made the 2 residents nearby exchange careful glances. Of course you do. Rodriguez, you've been here 3 months. You don't understand how things work yet. He finally looked up, his eyes moving down her frame as if assessing an intern who'd wandered into his office. The billing codes are handled by accounting. Not your concern. Katie's shoulders remained level. Her voice came out steady, deferential, the practiced cadence of someone who understood hierarchy. I wasn't questioning the billing. The medication inventory log seems incomplete. If the patient was discharged, the documentation should reflect that. Pierce set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair with a kind of deliberate slowness that made spaces around him feel smaller. You think accounting made a mistake? It wasn't really a question. Let me explain something. You stock fours. You take vitals. You empty bedpans. You don't audit codes. You don't investigate billing. You do what you're told, and you let people who've actually earned their positions handle the rest. One of the residents pretended to read a chart. The other found sudden interest in the monitor bank. Katie nodded once, the movement barely visible. Understood, Doctor. My apologies. She turned and walked back to room 347. Sergeant Marcus Chen lay in the hospital bed with the kind of stillness that came from discipline, not the stillness of someone sleeping, but the controlled immobility of a wounded soldier trying not to move anything that hurt. He'd been admitted 4 days ago for shrapnel removal from a blast that happened in downtown San Antonio outside a coffee shop, one of those moments that made no sense in a peacetime city. Katie had read his chart, 34 years old, Army Ranger, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, out of Fort Benning. She'd read that and her chest had gotten tight in a way she kept private. She checked his vitals with smooth efficiency, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 68, O2 sat at 98% on room air. Everything stable. Everything healing. How's the pain today, Sergeant? She adjusted the fall line with practiced precision, her movements economical, waste-free, the kind of movement that came from habit. Chen's eyes tracked her hands. There was something in his expression that shifted slightly when he looked at her, something that suggested he was reading her the way she was reading him. It's manageable, Them wasn't standard protocol. Most patients said nurse or nothing. Chen was showing respect. Katie's hands didn't falter. She'd trained herself years ago to compartmentalize. You could acknowledge something true and still function. Let me know if you need anything. I'll be back in 2 hours for the next check. She was turning to leave when Chen spoke again. His voice was lower, careful. Were you ever stationed at Bagram? Katie's hand froze on the four-pole for exactly 1/10 of a second. A hesitation so brief most people wouldn't notice it. She turned back, her expression composed, her eyes meeting his for the first time with full intention. No, Sergeant. Just passing through. The lie was smooth, practiced, the product of 3 months of building a civilian identity so carefully that even her reflection sometimes felt like someone else's. Chen nodded slowly. He didn't push. Veterans understood that some conversations weren't had in hospital rooms with open doors. Katie left his room and continued her rounds, her breathing still controlled, her pulse still level. The break room at Cedar Creek was a study in abandonment. Beige walls. Flickering fluorescent light in the corner that maintenance had been asked to fix 6 times. A refrigerator that smelled like someone's lunch had achieved sentience 3 weeks ago. On her 4th day, Katie had sat at the table with her packed meal, chicken and rice, the kind of fuel-efficient lunch that required no seasoning and took 7 minutes to eat, and watched as 3 experienced nurses grabbed their containers and left within 90 seconds. She hadn't understood then. By week 6, she understood perfectly. Dr. Pierce had a way of positioning himself near the break room around lunchtime, just close enough to be overheard. Rodriguez asked about my medication orders yesterday. Questioned my judgment on patient care. You know what that is? That's insubordination. The experienced nurses absorbed this the way institutions always absorb hierarchical messaging. By week 8, Katie was eating lunch at 5:45 a.m. in the supply closet, which was technically against regulation but involved no one witnessing her existence. She'd learned compartmentalization in Baghdad. Invisibility in the Army's administrative system came with a different kind of threat profile. At 8:15 a.m., as Katie completed her morning vitals run through the East Wing, she caught fragments of conversation from Dr. Pierce's entourage, a resident named Morrison and an attending named Dr. Castellano, who tolerated Pierce the way most people tolerate minor chronic pain. "Rodriguez again," Pierce was saying, always digging into details she shouldn't understand. "It's a competence issue." The resident nodded. Katie heard this from room 348, where she was adjusting an elderly patient's oxygen flow, her hand steady, her attention apparently focused entirely on the monitor readout that showed a heart rate of 62, sinus rhythm, regular as clockwork. She'd learned long ago that you could hear everything while appearing to hear nothing. That the best soldiers were the ones people forgot were in the room. The folded flag in her locker seemed to call to her during moments like this, her son David, who'd served under Marcus Chen's command, whose casket had been the last one she'd ever allowed herself to fully process grief over. The flag was her calendar. Each time she touched it, she marked another rotation through a world that had moved on without her. By 9:38 a.m., Katie had completed her morning rounds on all 14 ICU beds, documented all vitals, restocked the medication carts, and prepared 3 patients for their afternoon imaging appointments. She moved through the hospital the way water moves through landscape, finding the path of least resistance, present but unobtrusive, efficient without drawing attention. In room 347, Sergeant Chen was reading a Tom Clancy novel with the kind of focus that suggested military fiction was the only genre that made sense to him. Katie checked his incision site, clean, healing, no signs of infection. His color was good. His eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of someone trained to observe. "Your rotation in Baghdad," he said quietly, "that was 2019. Katie's hands continued their work. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She absolutely did not meet his eyes. "That was a long time ago, Sergeant." It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. But Chen was smart enough to understand that some operations stay classified even after you've left the service. Some names you carry without saying them out loud. At 9:45 a.m., Katie was in the supply closet, replacing stockings that would be used in the ICU by afternoon, when her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, "Captain. When you're ready." No signature. No context. Just those 4 words, and suddenly she understood that someone from her previous life had located her. That her identity wasn't as buried as she'd believed. That Cedar Creek Medical was about to become a very complicated place. She took a measured breath. Then another. Compartmentalize. Focus. The folded flag was still in her locker, waiting. The ranger in room 347 was healing. And whatever was coming next, she would face it the way she faced everything, with the kind of quiet control that made people underestimate what she was actually capable of. That's when the paging system crackled. "Code Blue, ICU, room 347. Code Blue, ICU, room 347. Katie's tablet dropped from her hand as she moved. By the time she reached the stairwell, her breathing had already shifted into combat rhythm, her muscle memory overriding her carefully constructed civilian training, and she was running toward the only voice in this hospital that had treated her like a human being. The real emergency was about to begin. The stairwell door swung open and Katie was moving, not running, never running in a hospital where running meant panic, but moving with the precision of someone who'd learned that speed without urgency saved lives. Her muscle memory had already shifted the calculation. Chen was in 347, the voice on the intercom had come from ER, which meant she had maybe 40 seconds before the sedation protocols kicked in and whatever was happening down there became a logistics problem instead of a medical one. She reached the ground floor landing just as the security radio crackled again. Arabic. The Mosul dialect, sharp and bitter, a man's voice shouting about betrayal, about Americans, about something that made her breath catch in her throat like she'd been physically struck. She'd heard that dialect in compounds at midnight. She'd heard it in the dark. Katie pushed through the ER doors and her vision processed the scene in fragments, 2 security guards struggling with a man who had to be 6'4", maybe 280 pounds, traditional dishdasher flowing, a shrapnel scar bisecting his left eyebrow like someone had drawn a line from his temple to his cheekbone with a piece of shattered steel. His hands were controlled despite the struggle, military bearing, even restrained. His eyes were looking for something specific in the room. His eyes stopped on Katie. The man went still. Not calm. Still in the way a predator goes still when it recognizes something familiar in the dark. Sakra, he whispered in Arabic, the word escaping like a prayer or a curse. Katie did not move. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She simply stood there in her scrubs, her name badge clipped to her collar, her hands at her sides, and let the silence stretch between them like a wire pulled too tight. Around them the ER staff shifted uncomfortably. The guards exchanged glances. One of them reached for something, a restraint, a sedative, whatever protocol demanded for an uncooperative patient. "You're mistaken," Katie said quietly in English, her voice level as a carpenter's level, not a tremor in sight. "You're confused from pain. That happens sometimes." The man's face twisted, fear and something like recognition and something else entirely, something that looked like he was seeing a ghost materialize in front of him and trying to decide if he should kneel or run. "Sakra pulled my cousin from Kivkush," he said in broken English, his accent thick as concrete. 17 hostages. The one who walks through walls. An ER nurse, Jennifer, who'd worked Cedar Creek for 12 years and knew better than to ask questions, was already preparing the sedation cocktail. 2 milligrams midazolam, 50 micrograms of fentanyl. Katie watched the dosages being drawn without comment. The man kept staring at her as the four-line was established, his pupils dilating as the medication hit, his lips moving like he was trying to memorize something before sleep took him. "Why do you hide?" he managed, his voice already slurring. "Warriors do not belong in," and then the medication pulled him under like a tide, and he was gone. Katie stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the stairwell, her breathing controlled, her heart rate elevated but manageable, her mind already compartmentalizing what had just happened into a box labeled "Do Not Open While Working." She had 14 more hours on shift. She had Chen in 3:47. She had charting to complete. She had a job. The box could wait until she was alone in her car at 3 in the morning. By the time Rashid Al-Mahdi was admitted to ICU observation in room 349 with a tentative surgical consult pending, the night shift had already begun. Katie collected the admission paperwork and read the baseline vitals without reaction, admitted via ER with acute abdominal pain, refugee status, arrived with Marine escort, 41 years old, no emergency contacts listed. The chart noted he'd been agitated and confused, standard notation for someone who'd been sedated mid-crisis. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would explain why he'd known a call sign that had been buried deeper than most classified programs. Nothing that would explain why Dr. Pierce was reading that same chart with his jaw clenched and his fingers moving across his phone screen with the intensity of someone sending urgent messages. During the 3 a.m. rounds, Katie had to enter Rashid's room regardless of what she needed to avoid. Vital signs didn't check themselves. The blood pressure cuff was cold against her palm as she approached his bed, and she kept her movements efficient, her expression neutral. Post-operative assessment. Fluid balance. Pain management. Standard protocols. Rashid was awake. His eyes tracked her from across the room with the precision of someone trained to read threats in the darkness. "Your vitals look stable," Katie said in her professional voice, the one she used with every patient, the one that revealed nothing. "Any pain on the scale of 1 to 10? 4, Rashid said, his English clearer now, the sedation beginning to metabolize. "But not from appendix." He turned his head to face her fully. The dim light of the monitor caught the scar tissue. "You do not sleep. Your eyes, they are the eyes of someone who has not slept in 10 years. Katie did not engage. She recorded the vitals on the chart and moved toward the door. The protocol was to leave. The protocol was to not acknowledge things that belonged to files marked classified. Sakra would not be a nurse, Rashid said quietly behind her. Sakra would be leading soldiers. Sakra would be commanding. Katie paused at the threshold but did not turn around. When she spoke, her voice carried no inflection whatsoever. Sakrar died in Baghdad. That's the official record. Everyone knows this. She turned back just enough to meet his eyes. Including you. That's why you're confused. The sedation. It happens. Then why, Rashid asked, does your badge say Rodriguez instead of what they called you in the compound? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent bed cycling air in measured rhythms. Katie's jaw clenched once, a micro-expression, barely visible, just a tightening of muscles at the corner of her mouth, but she forced her face back to neutral. If you need anything, use the call button. The night shift nurse will respond. She walked out and closed the door with careful precision, not slamming it, never losing control, just closing it like she closed every other door in this hospital. She made it to the medication room before she allowed herself one full breath. The problem was that Dr. Pierce had walked past her in the hallway not 30 seconds after she'd left Rashid's room, and he'd been reading something on his phone with that particular expression that meant he'd just received information he could weaponize. He'd looked up from the screen and made eye contact with Katie, and his smile had been the smile of a man holding an ace in a game nobody else knew was being played. Interesting admission in 349, he said, his voice conversational and dangerous. You're scheduled to assist with his pre-op assessment tomorrow at 0600. Make sure you're thorough. Understood, doctor. And Rodriguez. He leaned against the medication counter like they were old friends discussing the weather. Whatever conversation you had with that patient before sedation, make sure you document it accurately. Hospitals have liability protocols. I'm sure you understand. Katie's hands did not tremble as she organized the 4 supplies she didn't actually need to organize. I performed standard intake procedures, doctor. Nothing unusual occurred. Good. Keep it that way. He left, and Katie heard his footsteps move down the hallway toward the nursing station. The next morning came the way all mornings come in hospitals, too bright, too fast, and absolutely unforgiving. Katie had not slept. She'd sat in her car for 2 hours listening to the rain hammer the windshield like applause, staring at the folded flag on her passenger seat, the one with David's name on the memorial certificate, the one she couldn't bear to take inside, the one that seemed to be getting heavier every time she looked at it. 3 tours. 1 mistake. 1 son she'd buried without ever holding his hand in the hospital afterward because classified operations meant classified deaths, and you don't get to tell your family why your child isn't coming home. And now some man from Baghdad, some ghost from a compound she'd supposedly died clearing, was lying 2 doors away from the commanding officer who'd sent her boy into that operation. Morning rounds came at 0800. Dr. Pierce had requested Katie assist with Rashid's assessment, which meant she stood at the foot of the bed while Pierce performed the examination, palpating the abdomen, checking dressing integrity, ordering labs, while Rashid watched Katie instead of the doctor, his eyes reading her like she was a mission brief written in plain text. Tenderness is minimal, Pierce announced, scribbling on the chart. We'll proceed with surgery at 1400. Standard appendectomy, open approach, nothing complicated. He turned to leave, then paused. Rodriguez, get me a complete vital set every 2 hours. I want core temp, blood pressure, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation. And log every single visitor who enters this room. Hospital policy requires documentation when we have refugees with undocumented backgrounds. Liability purposes. The way he said it was casual. The way he said it was a trap laid across the door. Understood, doctor. And tell him, Pierce gestured vaguely at Rashid, that he's not to discuss his background, his reason for admittance, or anything related to his immigration status with hospital staff. That's a federal matter. If he does, you report it directly to me. Clear. Clear. Pierce left, and the room was silent except for the monitors. Rashid studied Katie's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a message written in a language only soldiers understood. He fears you, Rashid said quietly. Katie was already moving toward the door. He fears what he doesn't understand. That's different. Sakrar never belonged in a cage, Rashid said behind her. Not in Baghdad. Not here. Katie paused with her hand on the door handle. When she turned back, her eyes were flat and controlled, but her voice had dropped an octave lower, not just quieter, but different, carrying something that sounded like command authority underneath the softness. My name is Katie Rodriguez. I'm a nurse at Cedar Creek Medical in San Antonio, Texas. I have a job, and I do it well. Whatever you think you remember about someone named Sakra, that person is gone. You understand? Rashid nodded slowly. Yes. I understand. But she is not gone. She is right in front of me, trying very hard not to remember that she was alive once. Katie closed the door between them and did not return to that room for 2 hours. Instead, she found the break room empty, a rare miracle, and sat with her coffee going cold in her hands, staring at nothing, while her mind processed the calculation that had just shifted everything. Dr. Pierce knew something. Not everything, but something enough to know that Rashid represented a liability. That Katie represented a liability. That whatever was happening in room 349 was connected to something he needed to control. She had 14 hours until Rashid's surgery. 14 hours until Pierce could structure the OR schedule so that he was the one who could determine what happened to her if she stepped out of line. 14 hours until her past and her present collided in a way that would make her job seem like a luxury she could no longer afford. The coffee went down bitter. The medication room was 6 feet square. Claustrophobic. White walls, metal shelves, the sharp sting of antiseptic cutting through the recycled air. Dr. Pierce closed the door behind Katie with the deliberate care of someone securing a coffin lid. His shoes, Italian leather, probably $300, clicked against the tile floor. 1 step. 2 steps. He stopped inches from her. We need to talk about your assignments, he said. Katie's jaw tightened. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Just waited. The fluorescent light above them buzzed like an angry insect trapped in its fixture. Pierce's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted in his life. I'm reassigning your patients, effective immediately. You're too close to Sergeant Chen. And that refugee in the ICU, Al-Mahdi, he makes you visibly uncomfortable. Both observations I've documented, by the way. Sergeant Chen's care has been optimal, Katie said. Her voice came out level, measured. The voice of someone trained to keep breathing when the world was collapsing. Mr. Al-Mahdi's needs have been managed appropriately. Pierce stepped closer. The space between them shrank. It wasn't a suggestion, Nightingale. You're now assigned to pediatric overflow only. Nothing but bed checks and vitals for the next 90 days. Let me be crystal clear, I'm protecting this hospital. And I'm protecting you. He smiled. He shouldn't have. From yourself. He handed her a printed reassignment order. Katie's eyes scanned it. Already signed. The floor supervisor's signature at the bottom, a woman named Rodriguez had worked at Cedar Creek for 14 years and had never once questioned Pierce's decisions. That changed yesterday. Pierce had called her into his office for exactly 12 minutes. Katie knew because she'd timed the clock on the break room wall. Rodriguez came out with her jaw set like concrete. You understand what this means? Pierce asked. Katie understood. It meant no more morning rounds with Chen. No more access to his chart. No more ability to catch what was happening to his medications. She was being severed. Cut off. Surgically removed from the one patient who might have recognized her, protected her, or worse, dragged her entire military history into the daylight. She folded the reassignment order into thirds and slipped it into her scrub pocket. When do I start? Now. Pierce opened the medication room door. Fresh air rushed in like relief, but Katie didn't move toward it. She turned and walked to the supply station, pulled up the patient roster on the computer terminal, and began reading the updated med schedules. That's when she saw Chen's chart. His pain medication, hydromorphone, prescribed at intervals of every 6 hours, had been changed. The new order read every 4 hours. Standard dosage was 2 mg per administration. The new order read 3 mg. More frequent. Higher dose. Beyond what his current condition justified. Katie's hands moved on their own, fingers navigating the computer system, and she took a screenshot with her personal phone. A photographer capturing evidence at a crime scene. The phone screen glowed in her pocket like a tiny bomb. That afternoon, a pharmacy delivery arrived at the Cedar Creek medication lockup. Katie happened to be restocking for bags 3 feet away when the delivery driver rolled in a cart loaded with foam-insulated boxes. She caught the manifest as it passed. Biologics. Expensive ones. Immunotherapy compounds worth maybe $4,000 a vial. 6 vials on the invoice. But when she checked the patient orders, pulling up every active account in the system, there were no corresponding prescriptions. No patients assigned. No justification for why Cedar Creek Medical needed 6 vials of a drug that wasn't prescribed to anyone currently in the building. She mentioned it to the floor supervisor. Rodriguez's face went hard. Dr. Pierce handles specialty medications directly. It's above your pay grade, Captain, nurse. The hesitation lasted maybe 0.2 of a second. A slip. Rodriguez had almost called her by a rank that didn't exist in the Cedar Creek system. Katie filed that away. Another screenshot. Another piece of the puzzle. She watched Pierce from the pharmacy window 20 minutes later. He signed for the delivery personally. His signature flowed across the receipt like calligraphy. Then he turned to the medication lockup computer and began logging entries. Katie counted the vials as he scanned them into the system. 1, 2, 3. He paused. His fingers moved. The 4th vial disappeared. 5th vial. 6th vial. When he finished, the computer showed 3 vials logged. He'd recorded half. The other 3 existed nowhere. Ghost medicine. Black market pharmaceuticals moving through a hospital system like smoke through a sieve. Katie didn't move. Didn't react. Just stood there restocking for bags with the mechanical precision of a machine, watching a man commit pharmacy fraud 3 feet from her face. Pain is data. Information. And she was collecting it. That evening, as she headed to her locker, she found an envelope waiting. White. Official hospital letterhead. Her name printed on the front in block letters. She opened it standing there, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands, and she made her hands stop trembling immediately, folding them against her body, reading the words with the same flat effect she'd used to read a casualty report. Notice of peer review investigation. The date was Monday, 4 days away. The charges filled 3 pages. Exceeding scope of practice. Undermining physician authority. Insubordination. Unstable judgment. Each citation referenced a specific hospital policy, 7.2.4.b, Section 12.3.1.a, Regulation 4-9. The policies were cross-referenced to one another. Designed to seem systemic. Designed to show a pattern of behavior. Designed to make Katie Rodriguez look like a liability the hospital couldn't afford to keep. The signature at the bottom was printed. Dr. Michael Pierce, M.D., Chief of Cardiology. But that wasn't the worst part. The back page contained a secondary form, a recommendation for suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. It was already submitted to hospital administration. Already processed. Katie's job status was hanging on a technical thread, suspended in the space between now and Monday, existing in a state of quantum uncertainty. She could still work. But she couldn't be assigned to critical patients. Couldn't make real decisions. Could be pulled from the floor at any moment if administration decided the optics looked worse than the security. Pierce had built the paper trail with the precision of a tactical team laying out an assault plan. Each piece of documentation laid a foundation for the next. Each policy violation led to the next violation. Each incident cross-referenced to create an unassailable pattern of behavior. By Monday, when the review happened, it wouldn't matter what Katie said in her defense. The narrative was already written. The case was already built. All Pierce had to do was present it, and a hospital administrator, someone who'd never seen Katie work, never watched her save lives, never stood beside her while she held someone's hand as they died, would make a decision based on paperwork. Based on the careful architecture of a lie. Katie sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. Her eyes stayed fixed on the building ahead, the lights glowing in the ICU wing where Sergeant Chen was probably sleeping, where his medications were being delivered on a schedule designed to keep him comfortable or complicit or both. The folded flag sat in the passenger seat beside her, still wrapped in its original plastic from the funeral home. She'd never taken it out. Never let herself look at it in full daylight. Just kept it there, a reminder that some gifts can't be unwrapped. She got out of the car. Walked back inside. Passed through the ER, quiet at 7 p.m., just the machine sounds and the distant pages, and took a position near Chen's room despite her reassignment. Technically, she had no right to be there. Technically, Pierce could call security. But Katie had learned a long time ago that the most important things were always slightly illegal. Always technically indefensible. Always necessary. Chen was sleeping. For line running clear. Heart monitor showing a steady rhythm. She didn't go in. Just stood there in the hallway where the light from his room fell across her shoulders, watching a man she'd known for 5 years of war watch her back now, in this sterile place where neither of them could speak the truth. The folded flag could stay in her car. For now. For just a little longer. But Monday was coming. And Pierce had already written the ending. At 2:17 p.m. on Friday, Katie heard the sound before she even reached room 347. A specific pattern of labored breathing, the kind she knew from field medicine, from triage tents, from a compound outside Baghdad where lungs sounded exactly like this before they stopped working. She was supposed to be restocking 4 bags in the supply room, reassigned, invisible, deliberately kept away from Sergeant Chen. But the sound pulled her like gravity. She entered despite everything. Chen's lips were blue. His trachea deviated sharply left, visible even under the hospital gown. Tension pneumothorax. The 2 nurses assigned to him stood frozen in the doorway, their eyes moving between Chen and a monitor showing O2 sat at 71 and dropping. One of them opened her mouth. Neither of them moved. Katie didn't hesitate. Her voice came out steady as a surgical laser, call the code. Move. She was already moving. The crash cart was 6 feet away. Her hands moved on their own, the kind of automatic precision that lives in muscle memory, in 487 emergency procedures across 3 continents. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She prepped the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks as if her own body was a map she'd memorized years ago. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like pressure release, like breath after drowning. 40 seconds. That's all it took. Chen gasped. His first full breath was audible, desperate and real and alive. His color began returning from blue-gray toward something human. The O2 monitor climbed, 75. 78, 82. Stable. Katie stepped back just as Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his face going carefully blank as he surveyed the scene. She expected acknowledgement. Some recognition of the save. Instead, his eyes moved from Chen to Katie to the needle still draining air, and something cold shifted behind his expression. Everyone out except Rodriguez, he said quietly. The other nurses left. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Chen's breathing steadied. Katie kept her posture controlled, her face neutral, waiting for what came next. She knew this silence. She'd heard it in interrogation rooms, in generals' offices, in the moment before court-martial proceedings began. Pierce stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost reasonable. You just performed a procedure outside your scope of practice. That's my license on the line, do you understand? Katie's voice came out quiet steel. That's a patient's life saved, do you understand? Pierce's jaw tightened. He turned and left without another word, but she could feel the calculus shifting behind him as he walked away. This wasn't containment anymore. This was an opportunity he'd been waiting for. By 3 p.m., the incident report had been filed. Hospital Policy 7.2.4.B are performing procedures outside scope of practice. Her signature was required on the bottom, an acknowledgement of violation, a piece of evidence for the case he was building. She signed it without hesitation. Muscle memory had taught her years ago that documentation was survival. But that wasn't the worst part. By 3:11 p.m., 3 additional complaints had reached the medical board. Katie didn't see them yet, but they were coming like a coordinated strike, each form carefully worded to build on the others. The first cited reckless endangerment. The second described practicing medicine without a valid license. The third connected them both to a pattern of insubordination with direct patient safety implications. Each complaint cross-referenced the others. Each one made the previous look more damning. It was the work of someone who understood bureaucracy the way soldiers understand terrain, knowing exactly which lines would cut the deepest, where the system would press hardest, how to make the paper trail look inevitable. At 3:56 p.m., Katie received a call to report to HR. She already knew. She'd seen this before in different uniforms, different buildings, same ending. The administrator, a woman named Teresa Huang who'd hired her 3 months ago with genuine warmth, wouldn't meet her eyes. This is difficult. We've received multiple complaints. Until the investigation is complete, we need you to step back from floor duties. Your access badge has been suspended. Katie nodded. One measured breath. I understand. Security was gentler than she expected. A young officer named Marcus who'd always been polite when she passed the front desk. He helped her gather the few belongings from her locker, a change of clothes, a small framed photo of David from his high school graduation, her phone charger wound tight. He didn't speak. Some people understood that silence was a kindness. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have been. Just stuff. Just objects. Just the physical evidence of a job that had lasted 92 days. She walked out at exactly 4 p.m., her hospital badge deactivated at the front desk, the afternoon shift watching with the careful disinterest of people who'd learned not to ask questions. Through the ICU window, she saw Sergeant Chen in room 347, propped against pillows, his eyes tracking her movement down the corridor. He mouthed something, "I'm sorry," she thought, or maybe "thank you." His hand pressed against the glass. She kept walking. The drive home took 17 minutes. She knew the route by heart now, IR-37 north to Commerce, the turns through the residential streets, the driveway she'd repainted last month thinking she was building something permanent. She pulled in at 4:40 p.m., 4 hours too early, the afternoon sun making the house look hostile and strange, like somewhere she didn't belong anymore. David was waiting on the front porch. 17 years old, wearing his father's dog tags over his t-shirt, dark eyes that carried too much understanding already. "Mom? Why are you home?" Katie tried to form words. Nothing worked. She walked past him into the kitchen and sat at the table still wearing her scrubs, still carrying the smell of antiseptic and floor polish, still standing in the boundary between two identities that had been crashing into each other for 92 days. The tears came without permission, the first time she'd broken since Baghdad, since the compound, since the classified op that had erased her from existence. Her hands pressed against her face and the weight of it all pressed back. David stood frozen in the doorway, watching his mother collapse into herself, and asked the only question that made sense, did someone die? Katie's hand shook. Not fear. Restraint. Everything she'd held in rigid containment for months was pressing against the surface now. "No," she whispered. "I saved someone. I saved his life. And that's why everything is gone again." David moved to her then, placing his hand on her shoulder the way a soldier comforts the wounded, careful, present, without expecting her to explain what couldn't be explained. Outside, the Texas sun hammered the driveway like accusation. Inside, the folded flag locked in her car trunk seemed to press heavier against the metal, one more piece of grief she couldn't bear to display, one more loss she carried in silence. Katie Rodriguez, who had commanded men through fire, who had extracted hostages from compounds, who had earned medals and scars and a call sign whispered in enemy radio chatter, sat at her kitchen table and wept for a career that had lasted exactly 92 days. 3 days later, she returned to Cedar Creek Medical to collect her final paycheck from HR. 3 days later, Katie walked through the main entrance of Cedar Creek Medical in civilian clothes, jeans, a faded Army physical training shirt, boots that had walked through Baghdad and San Antonio alike. The late afternoon sun cut across the parking lot in long strips of gold. She wasn't here to save anyone today. She was here to collect a check and collect the final piece of her destroyed life. The HR office was on the 3rd floor. She knew the elevator route better than she knew her own apartment. The fluorescent lights of the corridor flickered like a heartbeat losing rhythm. A nurse she'd trained with 2 months ago saw her, looked away fast, not cruelty, just the reflexive movement of someone avoiding contagion. Katie had been marked by association with insubordination. That was how Pierce worked. Not with obvious cruelty, but with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, cutting away everything around it until even people who liked you had to pretend you didn't exist. She was signing the termination paperwork when the ICU erupted. The sound came first, a roar in a language that belonged to another continent, another life. Arabic. The words were sharp as gunfire, clipped with the urgency of someone calling out coordinates under fire. Then came the impact of boots on tile, heavy and deliberate, the sound of security personnel scrambling, chairs overturning. Katie's hand froze mid-signature. Her body recognized that voice the way a compass recognizes true north. The footsteps were thundering toward the ICU. That meant Sergeant Chen. Katie was moving before the HR administrator could say anything, her legs carrying her toward the emergency stairwell instead of away from it. Pain is data, she'd learned in Baghdad. And her pain was screaming that something was about to happen that would change everything again. She'd been wrong 3 days ago when she thought her lowest moment had already arrived. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. The ICU corridor was chaos rendered in white coats and scattered equipment. A massive man, easily 6'3", 300 pounds of muscle built from something harder than a gym, scarred across the left side of his face like shrapnel had tried to take half his skull, was shoving past security with the ease of someone who'd pushed back against much worse. His eyes were locked on room 347 where Chen lay in recovery. 3 security officers were trying to slow him down without actually engaging. They looked like children attempting to redirect a freight train. Katie saw the scene compress into a single moment of recognition. The massive stranger wasn't violent, he was desperate. There was a difference. She'd seen desperation in the eyes of civilians in Baghdad who thought they'd never see their families again. She'd felt it in her own chest when she held her son's folded flag for the first time after the army sent it home in a cardboard box the size of a showbox. She walked directly toward him with her hands visible, her palms open, her movements deliberate and empty of threat. The stranger's momentum stopped like she'd thrown a line around his chest and hauled back. His eyes locked onto hers. For 2 seconds, neither of them breathed. Katie watched recognition bloom across his face the way it blooms in a thermal scope, slow and then suddenly everywhere at once. His scarred hand came up to his mouth. "Sakra," he whispered. Not a question. A name. A ghost. The call sign that the Iraqi fighters had given the American operator who'd vanished into the smoke of a compound in 2019, the one who'd extracted 17 hostages including the stranger's sister, the one the Pentagon had classified so thoroughly that her existence had been erased from every database except the ones that still mattered. The ones in the memories of the people she'd saved. Katie took one measured breath. She didn't confirm or deny. She simply nodded once, the smallest movement, a language that transcended words. That's when the Marine veteran emerged from room 348 where his father was recovering from triple bypass surgery. He was young, maybe 26, still moving with the careful precision of someone relearning his body. He'd heard the Arabic shout. He'd heard the security scramble. And he'd heard the name, Sakra, spoken like a prayer by a man who looked like he'd survived things that should have been unsurvivable. His phone was already in his hand. His fingers flew across the screen. He pulled up a citation, military formal language, the kind of document that gets locked in safes. Silver Star. Captain Rodriguez. Citation for Vela. The words came out of his mouth like a man reading scripture. 19 hours of continuous operations in hostile territory. 6 civilians evacuated from a compound under active fire. One operator, Captain Katie Rodriguez, coordinated the extraction while engaging superior numbers. Sustained combat operations for extended duration without support or extraction guarantee. The hallway went silent. The kind of silence that happens when the world stops spinning and everyone holds their breath waiting to see if it will start again. Then a voice cut through like a blade. That captain saved my nephew's life in Baghdad. You will stand at attention. A 2-star general was being discharged from the cardiac care unit, still in his hospital gown, still moving like his body remembered having authority even when his uniform wasn't there to confirm it. He looked directly at Dr. Pierce, who'd appeared in the corridor like a man drawn by some instinct for self-preservation, and found instead the moment of his complete unraveling. Pierce's face was the color of old marble. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The general stared at him the way one might examine an insect under magnification. You will stand at attention when speaking to an officer, Doctor. In the tech station 3 floors below, Marcus Webb watched it all unfold on the security monitors. Webb was 24, decorated with his own invisible wounds from his own deployment, bullied for his anxiety and his trembling hands by everyone except Katie, who'd asked him quietly if there was anything he could do about the security footage that had been deleted. Webb's fingers flew across his keyboard with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who's been trained in exactly which keys to press under fire. He'd been watching Pierce for 3 weeks, capturing everything he could see. Now Pierce was at his desk, panicking, pulling up the hospital security server from his desktop computer. Webb watched him frantically delete files. Pharmacy deliveries. Recorded conversations with pharmaceutical representatives, altered digital charts. 1 file every 12 seconds. Delete. 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 Webb's hands moved like they belonged to someone else. Screen recording. Mirror backup. Cloud storage. Every deletion captured and preserved. He grabbed the external hard drive and walked upstairs. By 4 p.m., Pierce was in the executive suite with the hospital CEO and legal counsel. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to pull up the evidence of Katie's incompetence, to construct the narrative that had worked so well for so long. His fingers fumbled with his phone. The files were gone. Technical glitch, he said. The CEO slid a tablet across the desk. Web screen recordings played like a confession. Pierce deleting evidence. Pierce signing for medications that never appeared in patient records. Pierce modifying charts at times when no patients were being treated. 47 minutes of video showing a man systematically destroying evidence while a young IT specialist preserved every second of it. Your medical license will be suspended effective immediately, the CEO said. Criminal charges are pending. Pierce's hands shook as he signed the documents that ended his career. On his way out, he passed Katie in the main lobby. She was standing with Chen's wife, who was thanking her for saving his life, her face wet with the kind of tears that come from someone who'd been given back the person she loved most. Pierce tried to speak. His mouth moved, but the words didn't come. Katie turned to look at him with eyes that had seen worse things than his humiliation. She took one measured breath. Her voice was quiet, each word falling like a dropped stone. You saw weakness, Dr. Pierce. You didn't see that some people rebuild themselves from nothing because they've already survived the worst day of their lives. 6 months passed like a scar forming. Dr. Pierce taught CPR fundamentals at San Antonio Community College for $16 an hour. His hands demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy to students who checked their phones. His medical license was permanently revoked. The investigation revealed 2 years of pharmaceutical kickbacks totaling $340,000, systematic drug diversion, insurance fraud documented down to the penny. He would never practice medicine again. The silence of that knowledge pressed against him every single day. Katie worked crisis response for a private security firm, the kind of work that lived in the space between hospitals and battlefields. Executive protection. Medical support for operations that required someone who understood both trauma and triage. She was good at it. Better than good. The kind of good that comes from someone who'd been rebuilt from nothing and learned exactly how to help others do the same. But on Sunday mornings, she visited Sergeant Chen at Cedar Creek Medical, where he was recovering in the outpatient rehabilitation wing. They sat in the sunroom overlooking the Texas Hill Country, the light coming through the windows golden and soft. Her son David's folded flag rested on the windowsill between their chairs now, the plastic case catching the sunrise, the fabric inside preserved like a sacred relic. Chen and Katie didn't need many words anymore. They'd earned a language that lived deeper than speech. Other people had started coming to these Sunday visits, the Marine from room 348, now a nursing student. General Morrison, still recovering but strong. Even Rashid, who'd become a translator at Fort Sam Houston and understood in ways that civilians never could what the silence between them meant. They brought coffee and stories and sat with a woman who'd walked toward danger when everyone else had run. On her way out one Sunday, Katie passed the ICU nurses' station where the staff who'd once avoided her now nodded with genuine respect. The new floor supervisor, promoted after Pierce's termination, stopped her with an offer, full-time position, critical care unit, the kind of opportunity that most people would have taken in a heartbeat. Katie smiled and touched the flag folded under her arm. "I appreciate it," she said. "But I found where I belong, somewhere between the hospital and the battlefield, helping people who fall through the cracks." In the parking lot, Webb the IT specialist caught up with her, slightly out of breath. "Captain Rodriguez," he said. "I wanted to say thank you for showing me that standing up to bullies isn't just about courage. It's about documentation." Katie laughed, a real laugh, the first one in years that came from somewhere other than survival. Webb smiled back, and for the first time since his deployment, he wasn't shaking. She climbed into her truck where a photograph sat on the dashboard, David in his Ranger uniform, Sergeant Chen standing beside him, both smiling the way soldiers smile right before everything changes. Katie touched the frame and started the engine, heading home through the San Antonio dusk. The flag was folded in her bag, waiting for next Sunday's sunrise, waiting for the circle of veterans who'd learned that sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns, they carry the weight of saving lives and the strength to know when to walk toward danger instead of away. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were, please like this video and subscribe. Share this in the comments. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about the strength that lives in quiet people, the ones we almost never see until the moment they step into the light.